Ladies and gentlemen, take your seats. We're going to get started. We do not have quorums of both committees, but we can start with presentation. So, Ms. Spears, would you please call the roll, even though we don't have a quorum? Call the roll. And we'll note when people come in, a quorum is established.
Chair Morrell present, Councilmember Thomas present, Councilmember Moreno present, Councilmember Jeruso present. We do not have a quorum.
Okay. With that, we will start with the presentation by Energy New Orleans, item number 4 regarding hurricane preparedness.
Good afternoon.
This one works.
Okay, and before we get started, I wanted to make a quick announcement. This year, Entergy New Orleans is hosting, we have 5 summer interns from Youth Force NOLA, and we have 2 of them here with us today. I can't see them right now, but y'all can just wave. We have Canarion Hunter, who's interning with my group with Regulatory and Public Affairs. Canarion lives uptown and is a student at Sarah T. Reed and is interested in 3D printing and technology. And then we have Ramika Sullivan, who's interning with Sandra's group with customer service. Ramika lives in New Orleans East. She's a student at Livingston Collegiate Academy and is interested in nursing. So I just wanted them to come and see. Thank you. Welcome them and have them, encourage them to get part of the process. So they're here today to listen in. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Courtney Nicholson, Vice President of Regulatory and Public Affairs for Entergy New Orleans. I have with me Miss Sandra Miller, Vice President of Customer Service, and Stephen Binyard. I don't know if you guys have met him. Most of you have met him perhaps in private meetings, but Stephen is the Vice President of Reliability for the state of Louisiana. So Stephen and Sandra, I'll turn it over to them to start with our hurricane prep presentation.
Thank you, Courtney. Good afternoon, everyone. All right, so as far as our presentation today, we wanted to really dive in and talk about all our preparations for this year's upcoming hurricane season. We understand that severe weather is impacting our region with increased strength, as well as frequency and unpredictability. And what comes with that is rising storm costs. And we understand that. And we recognize that we need to do something different. And we understand that we also always need to strike a balance between spend and affordability. That's why we propose our 10-year accelerated resilience filing to prepare for future severe storm weather fronts that come through our system. As well as year over year, we do a lot of our reliability work in the system to ensure that we're monitoring, giving our customers the service that they deserve. Building a resilient grid is what we do. It's been a part of our business for decades, but when it comes to the grid, resiliency is not only the strength of our system, but how quickly we restore our customers after a major event. And we understand that we need to get back to some set of normalcy as quickly as possible. So as far as storm preparations, we prepare 365 days a year. We go through our inspection cycles on all of our equipment, as well as our vegetation management, trimming cycles, our training, and then we have a lot of industry collaborations across the system to ensure that when we are in our time of need, we can pull in tons of resources from other IOUs in the continental United States. So we prepare for the worst of what Mother Nature has to bring for us. But we understand that we live in the southeast part of the United States. We are prone to an increasing severity of weather events. That said, I know it's there's a different, you can look at the science, but also some folks don't believe in the actual climate change. But with that said, being an engineer myself, I like to look at the data. So what the data tells me is Obviously, we live in a prone part of the United States for severe weather events. That said, when you look at the data, the past 50 years, there have been 9 major hurricanes that hit the continental United States. When I say majors, that's category 4 and category 5. Within the last 5 years, there's been 6 major hurricanes that hit the United States. Out of those 6, 2 of those hit right here in Louisiana, Laura and Ida, we experienced just a few years ago. So with that said, we are storm ready. Our programs are here to ensure that we're ready to respond to our customers. For example, our 100% lateral and feeder program are here to touch our feeders in a cycle of over 8 years, wherein we touch all of our feeders in our system and we touch them from tip to tail. And we've been seeing great benefit in that. So as far as the performance of our circuits that have been through that program thus far in our 8-year cycle, we're seeing 30 to 40% better improvement in our service unavailability, which is our SU when our feeders go out, as well as our frequency. The other thing that we have is the focus program. So if we see other things that are unique to or a circuit or wherein that we can pinpoint the actual cause of an event, we can just dive in and fix that specific thing through data and understanding what our facilities need through trending analysis. Another program I'd like to mention, we're doing some work on our CBD. We're doing some replacements on certain types of transformers where we see that when they were made and how they're made, they're not to the modern standard. So we're doing some replacements as well as proactively. We also have a maintenance program that's purely driven by data analytics and understanding what things, like for example, in our substations, what assets we need to touch and renew over time. And then of course, vegetation is one of our leading causes of outages. And we're making sure that we have our trim cycle. Our trim cycle is 18 months to 2 years. And we go through that trim cycle where we inspect and understand what we need to go after to get rid of those hot spots throughout our system. We also do hotspot trimming where we find points of failure that potential failure in our vegetation management, our vegetation system that we address as well. So in addition to kind of our programs I discussed, we are doing tons of monitoring of our weather patterns. It's a 24/7 operations for us, 365. We look at our weather forecasts as well as computerized models to understand the devastation if we did have a storm pop up on us. We understand sometimes we don't have as long of a time when these weather systems develop. Sometimes they pop up in the Gulf and they're upon us rather quickly. So we make sure that we train and drill. Like for example, in the picture you can see this is the storm drill we have for our entire state of Louisiana just recently, where we pulled all of my people leaders across the state to come in and talk about the new technologies that we have. We trained on it, we put hands on it, as well as we looked at our best practices for the last few years through storm restoration. So we understood and made sure that all our newer employees could replicate the good things that we've done in the past. We are industry leader in storm restoration. Through EEI, we have over the last 25 years, over 44 awards in storm restoration. And we're proud of that, but there's always room for improvement and we recognize that. So restoration is, I like to describe when people ask me, what is restoration? How do you do it? To me, it's kind of like a ballet. There's a lot of different aspects to it. You have first, when the storm passes, and even before the storm, we have a lot of pre-planning where we do a lot of assessments. And as the storm passes, we come in and we report those things up and roll those up to kind of understand the level of devastation that we do have. Then from there, we move to kind of the start of our system. We ensure our power plants have what we need to bring them back online as quickly as possible. A lot of these processes that I'm discussing happen in parallel. For example, we go and look at our transmission system to understand where we need to bring first light to our system. Then we go to our substations, which is the middle part, ensuring there's no debris or anything that was blown into those systems. So when we do ready to turn on the power for our critical customers, as we move through, like for example, the Sewage and Water Board, our critical hospital hubs, or our 911 systems, we have all those things in line to bring first light and make sure that all the critical circuits for our customers are on for them as soon as they are ready to return to the city. And if they stayed, even better, to bring back that normalcy that they deserve. So obviously, with all the things I described and all the crew movements, and we have to ramp up. And you know, we've managed to over 28,000 crews in the past that come into our system to help restore power to Louisiana as well as New Orleans. With that said, there's a lot of things that have to come into play. So When you think about resources, logistics, we have a lot of local vendors that we utilize, as well as internal personnel that help us to establish space camps and staging sites so that we can feed and house and ensure the people that are here to help us restore quickly and safely are safe and have the energy they need to restore and safely do what we need to do. So I get asked quite often when I talk to customers, what can they do to ensure that when we are restoring power, they're good to go so we can connect them back to our system. So here you can see on the monitor is a diagram of a weatherhead on a house. We actually had a tornado restoration that happened a few years ago, I remember, in the middle, right in the middle of the city. And the weatherhead of one of the houses was torn off. These are the things that you need to look for. If you look outside of your house after a storm and you see that your meter can or your actual weatherhead is torn off your house, those are the things that you need to ensure you get an electrician. So while we're still there, we can connect you on an emergency basis so you can get power as soon as you can receive it. So that's one of the important things I want to pass along that people kind of overlook after a major weather event. With that said, the most important thing for me and what I tell all the folks that that work for me across the state is, if anyone gets hurt during a restoration event, we're not successful. So I understand that the public loves our linemen. They love to watch what they do. They provide a major service to the city. But, you know, step back, you can observe them from afar, but please don't step into their work zones. Let them focus on what they need to do to restore power as quickly and safely as possible. So I'll pass it over to Sandra Miller to talk a little bit more about the customer service aspect.
Good afternoon, council members. I want to talk to you a little bit about what we're speaking with customers about in the community. So we are hosting community meetings around the council districts. We are attending numerous neighborhood association meetings, speaking directly with customers about concerns and particularly about hurricane preparedness. We've hosted a meeting with our managed account customers, some of our larger customers and commercial customers, about hurricane preparedness. We're posted on social media as well as working with local media to make sure the public understands our hurricane preparedness and how to get in contact with us. One thing we're talking with customers about is how they can be prepared. We're prepared, but customers need to be prepared as well. We talk to them about preparing an emergency kit. And so one of the things that I think is important for us to recognize is that the severe weather events are coming through faster and furious and may not be necessarily related to a hurricane. Other parts of our service territory have been impacted by severe storms. And so we're encouraging customers to keep that kit available, that emergency kit available at all times, and actually pay attention to expiration on non-perishable goods and things that they may have in that particular kit. So that's been something important information that customers have been pleased to hear, and make sure that we're keeping them informed about how they can best themselves. Thank you. So we're talking to customers about preparing their house. They can make sure they have plywood ahead of time if there's a hurricane approaching, have hurricane shutters as well available on their homes. One of the important things is making sure they're trimming back trees and shrubbery that may impact their home should an event impact this area, cleaning out gutters and drain pipes, and making sure they're securing outdoor furniture, even garbage cans that can become a missile when we have a severe weather event. We're also encouraging customers to pay attention to what local officials such as yourselves are saying about that particular event. And before they leave home, to make sure they're turning off their electricity at the main fuse or the breaker or the water at the main valve. Some of the basics that you may not think about. And if there's no evacuation that's called and they have to shelter in place, making sure, again, they have that basic food and water. And also we're encouraging them to reach out to us to sign up for alerts through the My Entergy. Now, we have ongoing conversations, as you all know, subsequent to storms, we do have incidents where customers venture out and they may come in contact with utility wires, but that's the most dangerous part of the storm right after it's passed. And so we encourage customers to stay inside until officials and that we can say it's safe to venture out. Oftentimes, customers want to go out to just observe the damage or to take a drive to see what's open, but we're encouraging them, wait until it's safe to do so. Down lines, stay away from down lines and debris that could contain an energized power line running through it that you may not be able to see, and to report those down lines to 1-800-ENERGY. We're talking to customers about generator safety and making sure that they are operating their generator in accordance with manufacturer's specifications, and they're using licensed professionals to install those generators, because we have had incidents of carbon monoxide poisoning, even electrical shock and fires. And so we're encouraging them to use generator safety. Gas, we're talking to them about how to handle gas leaks. If you smell natural gas or if you hear a loud hissing sound, please call us immediately. Do not attempt to operate any electrical valves or gas valves. Move away from the area and call 1-800-ENERGY immediately. Again, after a hurricane event, there could potentially be flooding. And we encourage customers, do not walk through flooded water. Water and electricity can be a fatal combination. And so we're reminding them, please stay away from flooded areas subsequent to a storm. And remember that tree limbs can be a conductor of electricity. And so in returning home, again, we ask them to listen to local officials about when it's safe to return home and make sure they're driving on roadways and bridges that are passable. These are some basic things that we're reiterating with our customers to help keep them safe. Obviously, when we have a storm event in the summertime, it's often hot. And if the power is out, we could be dealing with extreme heat situations. And so we're encouraging customers to recognize the signs of heat illnesses and to stay cool and try to have many fluids as much as possible and utilize cooling stations that are being offered around the city if they need to do so. Another important piece of information that we've been talking with customers about, and we spoke with this council about this, I want to say on last year as well, about what we plan to do with the view outage map to make sure we're keeping customers informed. And so what we have been able to implement is what you see here is that pre-storm layer. So 48 to 72 hours prior to a storm's landfall, we will place the view outage map, and what you see here is a pre-storm view. And that will allow customers to see what historically that particular hurricane is approaching us, whether it's a 1 on up to a 5, what type of damage we can expect in the areas based on the path of the storm. So in the areas where it's green, we will anticipate there's going to be light infrastructure damage. And so the estimated restoration time will be shorter. In the areas where you see the yellow, it will be moderate infrastructure. And so the restoration time will be moderate. Obviously, in the areas where you see red, unfortunately, it shows here as if it's pink, but that's intended to be red. On the map, it will show up as red. But that's where we will see severe damage, and the estimated restoration times will be more extensive in those areas. Now, these are estimates based on historical models. Obviously, we will not be able to determine true restoration times until after we have done damage assessment and been able to understand exactly the condition of our grid at that time. So what happens next is that we will place the view outage map in what we call damage assessment view. That will show the outages by parish while we are taking the time to do the damage assessment. And what we'll be able to do is make sure that customers have information during that time about what we're seeing in the field so they can see the amount of damage that's going on. Once we have the damage assessment completed, we will switch it to what we call the estimated restoration time view. So this is important because following Ida, we wanted to make sure that we're giving customers more granular information, as granular as we could. So what this view will offer the customers is their feeder, the area where their feeder is serving their neighborhood. It will be color coded and an estimated restoration time will be provided for customers so they can go to this map and be able to see when they can anticipate power will be returned to their area. And finally, obviously, we're talking with customers about ways they can stay in touch with us. If there's an outage, again, we know there's a large number of people out, but we want to make sure that they are signing up and downloading our mobile app to report outages. They're texting us and signing up for communications, and they can text us for an outage by dialing, texting 36778 to report the outage, and then they can text stat in order to get status updates along the way. Obviously, they can report an outage through MyEnergy or call us directly. But these are, some of the things that we're talking with customers about around the city, and we just want to make sure you all know the efforts that we were putting in place in that regard. So that brings us to a close for our hurricane presentation. We do have some information that we want to talk to you about a verification process, but we'll pause here. And if you have any questions regarding our hurricane presentation, we'll take them now.
I have some questions for Mr. Benya. First of all, thank you guys. I'm sure I've probably seen I've seen a lot of customer service reports before. I don't know that I have seen a more comprehensive system reliability report, but it kind of invokes some questions to me about a little institutional knowledge versus, the system versus weather patterns. And I wrote down weather patterns versus weather events when you were talking. Is there a different type of system versus preparation versus response with hurricane versus tornado?
It's a similar type of response as far as how we manage the response. We still try to fall back to what we know as far as our incident command structure and try to pull in those elements. But it depends on the level of devastation if we go a full-blown incident command structure or a smaller incident command structure. That's the good thing about it. Based on the level of devastation, you can kind of compartmentalize how much folks you need to invoke to restore, and then understanding the timeline.
Okay, so that brings me to, so it's not about the weather event, it's about the level of the disaster or the damage.
That's correct.
Okay, so there would be no difference between responding to a tornado or the damage it does versus the damage that a hurricane does.
That's correct.
Okay, now I like the way you're kind of walking through the system, because I want to try to understand company philosophy in terms of investment too. And I'll use an example. I remember when previous mayors and previous officials, and I think Mary Landrieu took the lead on this early on, in that when they were petitioning the federal government and the Corps of Engineers for a $990 million levy system, right? And so they got all that information. We had the Hurricane Pam, that slosh model with Professor Ivan and that group. And it showed at a certain level what the devastation could potentially be like. So Mary went before Congress, went before federal authorities, kind of carried that water and said that based on these models, this is the investment we would need, right? So they said, okay, I know you need 990 million, but take 300. So if they had made a 990 million or $1 billion investment, maybe they wouldn't have spent in this area 71 billion. Kind of see where I'm going.
Absolutely.
So as you guys assess your system, and then with energy, I remember after Katrina, not only did your shareholders and your company have to come up with several $700 million, but you also petitioned and got 225 or $30 million, almost $250 million from FEMA funds to match with the hundreds of millions you guys came up with. So what do you guys do? And it was excellent report. So you're looking at system reliability. Where do you guys say, you know what, if we invest at this level, if we had listened to Mary, if the federal government had listened to Mary, they wouldn't have had to spend 71 billion. And what is the response? Because I think I'm kind of going somewhere. You never know, because there were slivers in the system that provided energy and electricity as much as 2 days after Ida, and some came back even quicker because the systems were different.
That's right.
So what do you guys do when you look at your investment? And I know everybody talks about their profit margin. So how do you all look at your investment and say, hey, you know what? This is where we are, but if we did this, it could save us more money on the back end. What kind of discussions and how do y'all view that, especially given your job?
You hit the nail on the head. That's where we are today with our resiliency plan that we've been discussing. If you look at it, if you spend money today in present time value, and before we even get to the money part, we did a study with 1898 where we ran thousands and thousands of scenarios of past storms as well as predicted storm patterns so that we cannot understand what we need to harden. So it's not a kind of go plate the system, but also if you focus on the circuits and the infrastructure that you need to touch to give the best value. So that's what we came up with the docket amount for our resiliency proposal right now.
Okay, so then my question is, those little slithers that we're able to provide quick turnaround, because I love your first comment, it was like how quickly we can restore. That's mostly what the citizens want to know. So when y'all look at that system that withstood a Hurricane 3, Category 4 or 5, and you evaluate, well, what was it about this particular part of the system that didn't become as damaged as the others? Is there a conversation about how you duplicate that or replicate that in the systems that were most damaged?
That's exactly the thought. And I'm blessed to I've done this before as far as the resiliency. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. If you go to
That's what y'all trying to do now. You
that's what we're trying
didn't
to
that
do
then.
now. That's what we're trying to do now. And I know, we had opportunities in the past and we can own that part, but now we're trying to move forward and see what we can do to save and continue to bring value to our communities at which we live. So if you do harden, if you are more resilient, you will save dollars and you will bring back the normalcy of the citizens quickly. It's like, for example,
Right.
It's like the example I like to talk about. And when you saw Hurricane Ian hit the coast of Florida, they had hardened, they are more resilient. So a storm like that kind of Cat 5, a severe storm, would took months, weeks. It took them 3 days. That's the type of things that we're trying to replicate here based on some of the benchmarking we've been
And I
doing.
only have two other things, and thank you, Chairman. Is there any report or fact-finding or brief that's a public document that says this community came back on, its resiliency was greater because of?
You can look at industry comparisons that do show that because of
I'm
resiliency.
talking about system, within your system.
Or within energy system.
Yeah, I'll give you an example.
Mhm.
The community that I live in, New Orleans East, we had light a couple of days afterwards because it was connected to that substation in New Orleans East.
And I was a major part of that. And I'll tell you why. The reason why New Orleans East was on at that time in that part of the restoration, because we needed that path to bring on that critical infrastructure. So that's the path that we chose, working with our transmissions team, working with our power plants, working on our distributions team to understand what was the correct path to bring power back.
But there was something about that system that made it the correct path
That's right.
to reach those other paths.
That's correct.
So then is there a conversation, how do we duplicate that in other communities?
That is a part of the study that we did recently with 1898. So that's exactly what we're trying to do.
Okay, and then the last thing, tree trimming, right? Especially given, I think we're in El Nino now.
That's right.
There's a certain thing that does to vegetation and growth. Trees seem like they're growing faster. Even when you cut the limbs, they're coming back quicker, especially with the heat and the humidity and some of the rain. Who's responsible for the tree between the sidewalk and the street
Between the sidewalk.
in terms of trimming? Who's responsible for
Anything
that?
within our right of way, we're responsible for trimming that's within the reach of our power line. Only problem we do have is we only can trim up to 4 feet. Other municipalities, other parishes, they can trim up to 8 feet, which gives you a longer, time for that vegetation to get back into our infrastructure. So it's kind of we're
It gives you
constantly
less tree, but more time.
I'm sorry, I missed that last part.
Less tree, but more time. Y'all can only do 4 feet, right?
That's right. That's
Other
right.
places you can do 8 feet.
That's right. That's right. That's
You're not
correct.
cutting 8 feet of line, you're cutting 8 feet of tree.
That's right.
Okay. All right, so you guys would like more time or less tree?
I like to have more time for the trees to grow before it touches our line, but also with resiliency, you can design where you can maybe push out and give us more time for that tree to reach us with different insulators, different configurations on our system as well.
So in neighborhoods where that tree is between the sidewalk and between the street, we can call y'all?
Yes, correct.
Okay, thank you.
Appreciate the questions.
Does anyone else have any other questions at this time before I speak? All right, on this topic, on this measure, we certainly appreciate the docket filing dealing with the 10-year plan to deal with resiliency. As I've expressed previously in the past, the council is taking a very critical look at that document. So we certainly support and agree that we need to have increased resiliency based upon the fact that with climate change, we're going to find ourselves facing more storms rather than less with increased severity. Cost is always a concern, and we will continue to have a dialogue on what the actual cost is and what's appropriate. Are there any public comments? I guess one on the internet.
There's one comment.
All right, one comment. And after the comment, we will vote on the 2 items that require a vote, and then we'll go back to the agenda.
The comment is from Marion Bracy. Greetings to the New Orleans City Council and the citizens of our great city. My name is Marion Bracy, and I currently serve as the VP for facilities at Dillard University, a position that I've held for about 10 months. Previously, I served as VP for facilities at Xavier University, where I was employed for almost 25 years. Both positions allowed me the opportunity to work with city leaders and utility providers. I stand before you today for a couple of reasons: to encourage better working partnerships and better communications between our city leaders and utility providers. On February 19th, 2023, the Sunday before Mardi Gras, I received an emergency call at 3 a.m. informing me of a campus-wide power outage. On a Mardi Gras weekend with a campus full of students, that's not a call you want to receive. After being assured that my team had done everything within their power to resolve this issue, I made a call to Jessica Williams, our energy account rep, who had just been assigned our account and we had never met personally. Ms. Williams made some calls and Stephen Vineyard immediately met with my team and contractors on campus. We worked together for 2 days, successfully re-energizing the campus on Mardi Gras Day just after 5 p.m. Unfortunately, the following Sunday at 3 a.m., the same situation repeated. The campus lost power due to equipment failure. Again, I made the dreaded phone calls to Ms. Williams and our energy partner came to the rescue. However, this time was somewhat different. We needed more from our partners. So after working through all the legal issues, Entergy did something I've never witnessed. They crossed the line to work on private property, assisting us in identifying our equipment failure. That's partnership. The Entergy team worked beyond boundaries and expectations, standing with us when we were at a low point. On May 9th, 2023, Entergy hosted an energy preparedness summit on the campus of Dillard University. The purpose was to ensure that organizations and individuals in the city could be informed and prepared for the next emergency. This was an intentional outreach by Entergy to the community to encourage relationships prior to the occurrence of weather emergency or a disaster. Unfortunately for the citizens of New Orleans, we often see finger pointing and blaming each other after an emergency event. Because we live in New Orleans, we can accept that emergencies will happen. But what is unacceptable is for our elected officials and utility provider to be unable to work. That is the comment.
Congratulations, Entergy. No, but I'm very aware of that situation and obviously it's in District D. And it was a very significant issue where students had to go elsewhere to even, take class.
That's right.
To live. But it was a good example of private and public partnership, working something out in a timely manner. So thank you, Marion Bracy, for those comments, and thank you for Entergy for that work.
Thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember. And we're continuing our partnership and our conversations with Dillard University regarding their needs, particularly their sustainability needs. So it's ongoing.
All right, we have 2 items that require a vote. The first is item number 2. We'll come back to streamlining right after this. The first is the minutes of the June 14th meeting of Governmental Affairs Committee. Moved by Councilman Green, second by Councilmember Thomas. All in favor? Any opposed? Hearing none, the minutes are approved. Next, we have an ordinance calendar 34-199. You want to read that for us?
The committee will consider an ordinance to establish city code section 26-551 relative to ownership of hotels and motels for licensing.
Thank you. For those of you who followed our original activities, the moratoriums on hotels and commercial STRs, this is some clarifying language regarding hotels to specify that hotels have to have singular management and ownership versus the ability for a building to be classified as a hotel and the rooms to be sold individually, and that will be prohibited in the structure. So with that, I will move to approve or approve favorably ordinance calendar number 34-199. Can I get a second? Seconded by Councilman Giarrusso. All in favor? Any opposed? Hearing none, it is reported favorably. Once again, back to the table.
Councilmember, this item may be off agenda, but it's my understanding you all wanted to
We-
have some discussion about it.
We will get to your presentation. We're voting while we have a quorum.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Okay.
You may begin your presentation.
Council member, we have one more voting item,
We do.
the resolution on streamlining.
Oh. I apologize. Can you please read the resolution? Thank you.
In summary, this resolution is a continuation of our streamlining docket. It simply states which requirements Entergy and the stakeholders have agreed to with Curo's input and recommendation. Head by Bobby Mason, my deputy chief.
Okay. I think that is pretty self-explanatory. I'll move to report it favorably. Can I get a second? Then Councilman Jeruso, please vote your machine. Oh, sorry, no machines. All in favor? Any opposed? Hearing none, supported favorably. Thank you.
So, council members, I understand that you all just had a few questions about our verification process, and to specifically talk about a recent challenge that we had with that particular verification desk. And so I wanted to make sure that I spent some time today addressing that process and answering any questions that you may have surrounding that. So let me start by saying, I think you all know, as well as the vast majority of the public knows, how important it is for us to verify who people say they are. And this verification of identity is a process that's used by utilities across the country so that we can ensure that we know who we are doing services with, and making sure that we're protecting our customers' identity as well. There's been numerous examples of cyber threats, cyber breaches, and security issues of information involving members of the public, your constituents, our customers. And so we recognize our obligation to do our due diligence to make sure we're protecting identities. I mean, you all know very well, it hits close to home in the state of Louisiana. We had the recent DMV breach. And so customers' information is out there in the public sphere. So we must do our part to make sure we are protecting customer information, as well as making sure that we know that individuals are who they say they are when they are asking for services from us. So let me talk to you a little bit about how that process works. And so every new customer that's seeking to have an account, they have to go through a verification process. The vast majority of those customers actually go through a real-time verification where we're able to verify their identity through the Experian data source that we partner with. So those customers can provide a social security number, and that usually can match up with the Experian source, and the account is automatically set up for that particular customer. Or they can provide a driver's license combined with a previous address, and that information, if it checks out with the Experian data source, again, an account is automatically set up. There's a smaller set of customers that has to go to a second level of identification because they did not provide the information up front. Either they did not have the social security information or the driver's license information in front of them when they called or went online to set up the service, or they didn't feel comfortable giving some type of information such as their social security number. So we have to do an additional verification, and those customers are sent to what we call the verification desk, and where they're asked for additional information. It could be, passport, state driver's license, in some cases, a lease agreement, to make sure we're able to validate that that person has the right to be at the location. So in any event, once they go through that second level of validation, the account is set up. Again, how this protects customers, we're making sure we're protecting them from potential identity theft. We're able to confirm the identity of individuals that we're doing business with to ensure that individual is authorized to accept services at that location, and they're accountable for payment of services to that location. And again, it also reduces fraudulence on the account. And it's, in this case, I'm talking about fraudulent name switching that could increase the cost to serve all customers. So there, in a nutshell, is really the reason why we have to make sure that the importance of verifying customers' identity, as well as the process that we were using up until around May the 25th, we did have a situation where we ended up having a backlog at that desk. And let me tell you what precipitated that. That work was actually outsourced to another vendor. So around that time, we actually were bringing that work in-house in order to save costs for our customers, as well as to provide a better experience. At the time we brought the work in-house and speaking with the vendor, we made sure we had the same number of employees that that vendor also used to service that desk. What we didn't anticipate was that the volume of around that time of year, the beginning of the summer and the end of the summer, we do have an increased volume of new service requests. That's historical. And so what we didn't have an understanding of what the vendor did around that time period to make sure that desk could flow properly. So what they did was they actually added additional employees they called flex resources to that particular desk during that time so we could keep the process flowing and customers communicated with in order to be able to have that second layer of validation. And in this particular case, when we realized what had occurred, we quickly pivoted and we quickly added additional resources to that desk from other parts of the call center, not just other parts of the call center, our local customer service specialists from the various operating companies, as well as our walk-in center employees actually had customers to come in and we were able to verify them so we could quickly get that backlog down. So the backlog was occurring around May the 25th through June the 16th, and we had that pretty much all the way back down by June the 21st. And so I know some of your offices did get some complaints about the backlog in our verification process. And I want to let you all know that that backlog has been decreased. We're back to normal procedures. And some of the things that we're doing to provide for a better experience, instead of customers having to wait for a phone call back from the verification desk, what we're putting in place is a process whereby when the customer calls for new service, the agents will be able to transfer them directly to that verification desk, and or if they don't have the information in front of them, then the agent will provide them the verification number so that customer can then call back and provide that additional information necessary to validate their identity for that account. So those are some of the things that we're putting in place, and we're still training the agents on that. And so we hope that that will be smoother and all set in place within the next week. Another thing that we're looking at doing is making sure that we're improving communications to those customers who end up in that second layer of validation so they can understand what's expected of them and the timeline that they have to provide that information to us. And finally, in keeping with our what we always do to look at the best practices, with other utilities, we recognize that there's some other opportunities out there to maybe to do additional real-time verification, such as an SMS PIN number to a cell phone that other businesses use to be able to identify and verify customers quicker, so they fall into that first bucket. And I will tell you, just for perspective, that from the May the 25th to June the 16th, during that time period, we had about 5,330 customers to apply for new service. 89% of them, 4,746 were actually automatically verified. So that smaller subset I talked about, 584, it was about 11% of the customers had to go to that second validation. And those were the customers that we had to quickly get down from the backlog and make sure we resource that desk quickly. And right now that desk is currently up to date, and it's a 24-hour turnaround. But again, we have instituted some things to allow customers to be able to contact that desk directly or be transferred to that desk. So I'll stop there and see if you all have any questions.
Are there any questions from the dais? Do we have any cards or comments? Okay, thank you.
Thank you all.
All right, next up, we have a presentation by the Bureau of Governmental Research, who will present their sewage and water board findings regarding the sewage and water board governance structure.
Thank you. Okay, hi.
Hi, you guys can get started whenever you're ready.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you so much for inviting us here today. We're thrilled to have the opportunity to present our research about the structure of the Sewerage and Water Board. My name is Rebecca Mowbray. I'm the president and CEO of the Bureau of Governmental Research, better known as BGR. And I am joined today by Stephen Stewart, our vice president and research director, and Jamie Cortez Parker, the research analyst who worked really hard on this report. So thank you. In our latest report, we examine some of the significant problems facing the Sewerage and Water Board and their connection to the utilities governance structure. BGR prepared this study independently as part of our mission to inform the public and policymakers about ways to improve government in the New Orleans area. And this report builds on our long line of research on the Sewerage and Water Board. Our report finds that the current governance structure contributes to many of the challenges that the Sewerage and Water Board faces today. We believe that if we don't address the structure, it will continue to pose risks to quality of life and sustainability in New Orleans. BGR's report focuses on the structural aspects of government, the governance, the laws and policies that shape the roles, responsibilities, and decision-making at the Sewerage and Water Board. And we note that even if you have capable leaders, they will struggle in a system that is poorly designed. We'd like to acknowledge the efforts by the Sewerage and Water Board management and the board to undertake key initiatives such as strategic planning and set a course for overhauling system infrastructure over the next half century. But again, that success will ultimately depend on the structure that they're working in. Okay, so the Sewerage and Water Board has a complicated structure with lots of players. But lots of entities being involved does not mean that there is effective oversight and accountability. In fact, it's the opposite. I'd like to run through some of the major players that are involved in the system. First is the Louisiana legislature, which created the Sewerage and Water Board in 1899 and continues to control the laws that spell out the utilities' powers, functions, and responsibilities, including the composition of its 11-member board of directors. The city also plays a major role in the current structure of the Sewerage and Water Board. The mayor serves as the president of the board and appoints the 9 citizen members. The city council, as you know, has a member that holds a seat on the board. And the city council is also responsible for the funding of the Sewerage and Water Board through the rates and taxes. The Sewerage and Water Board, the council rather, also has oversight of the Sewerage and Water Board in some limited areas as delegated by the legislature. The city's Department of Public Works also plays a role by managing the minor drainage system and working with the Sewerage and Water Board on drainage issues. So overall, this means that we've got this hybrid structure that really doesn't serve New Orleans very well. It's a very complicated system that on one hand functions like a standalone utility that's created by the state and is separate from city government, that's led by its own board of directors, has its own workforce and its own funding sources. On the other hand, it has some features of a municipal utility. The board is actually led by the mayor and includes a city council member. The city council, as previously mentioned, controls the utilities rates and taxes and must coordinate with the city on street and drainage processes. Our conclusion is that this hybrid approach does not serve us well and is directly responsible for many of the problems that we all see in our daily lives in New Orleans. I'd like to run through a few of those problems. First is the risk to the financial sustainability of critical infrastructure. As we mentioned, the council holds the authority to impose sewage and water board rates and taxes, but is not responsible for the sewage and water board's performance. What we've seen is that politics historically has entered into the council's funding decisions, which has contributed to historic underfunding and the poor state of today's infrastructure. It's also shifted the costs of the system to current and future ratepayers. And we also note that the city council has some oversight of the sewage and water board, but it lacks clear mechanisms to fully carry out this function. What ends up happening is that the council uses funding, the one card that it does have to play, as leverage to hold the utility accountable. Instead, what would be more constructive is having the focus of oversight being on working together with the sewage and water board toward the public good. There's also another concern of ours is the poor performance of the drainage system. As you know, the city handles the minor drainage system through the Department of Public Works, and the Sewage and Water Board handles the major parts of the drainage system. BGR looked at 51 other peer cities, and we found that no one does it this way. It's simply not a good idea to have responsibility for the system funded, for the system divided, and separate funding sources for the major and minor drainage systems only makes the system work. There's also ineffective coordination of infrastructure work between the Sewage and Water Board and the city government, as recently documented in an OIG report. The Sewage and Water Board and the Department of Public Works have struggled for decades to effectively coordinate this work. They have different systems for reporting infrastructure problems and managing work. And this creates opportunities for the Sewage and Water Board and Public Works to point the finger at one another and blame each other for poor performance, which isn't a very constructive thing to do and ultimately leads to diminished public confidence in our systems. We also have concerns about the long-term effectiveness of the utilities board of directors. The mayor plays a prominent role on the Sewage and Water Board's board as the president. On one hand, that can enable the mayor to be a powerful advocate for the Sewage and Water Board as a leader, which can help drive improvements. However, the role of such a prominent official can overshadow other board members and discourage the free-flowing exchange of ideas on a board, which can limit a board's effectiveness. And I'd like to acknowledge that this is talking about any mayor in this role, not our current mayor. The mayor's elevated role can also blur lines of accountability. Should the public hold the mayor or the board as a whole accountable for the Sewage and Water Board's performance? It's confusing. Another concern is the conflict of interest created by the city council member who serves on the board. And again, we're speaking of any city council member in this role. The council member in serving on the board must act in the best interests of the Sewage and Water Board. But at the same time, the council member is responsible for overseeing actions that they personally take as part of the board, while also representing constituent interests as a member of the full council. This can lead to just a conflict and that you see play out whenever the Sewage and Water Board and the council don't see eye to eye on things such as potential funding increases or pending litigation. And most significantly is our concern about the legislature's substantial control over local utility matters. It is impossible to address most of the Sewage and Water Board's problems without driving to Baton Rouge. This gives lawmakers with little or no connection to New Orleans broad authority to decide matters of local interest. Okay. BGR recognizes that pursuing governance reform will take a significant effort for you as a leader. So why should you do it? Because it will create a stronger framework for current and future leaders facing 50 years of system rebuilding ahead. It will also lay the foundation for greater reliability and efficiency for the public. and help to build public trust among current and future generations of ratepayers and taxpayers. So our report's main recommendation is that the mayor, as the leader of the city's administration and the president of the Sewerage and Water Board, to take the lead on this issue and further study the two governance reform options that we came up with. We encourage the mayor to select a path forward. And we think the mayor should do this in close coordination, of course, with the city council, the Sewerage and Water Board, and go to great lengths to include public input in this very important decision. So we see two main paths. The first path would keep but improve the Sewerage and Water Board as a standalone utility that operates separate from city government. We think that targeted reforms could really help improve the current status of the Sewerage and Water Board. One example is rebalancing the mayor's power on the board by having the president pro tem, who is a citizen member of the board that is elected by the full board, lead the utilities public meetings and let the board make committee assignments. We also think that it would be wise to take advantage of an existing law to have a civil engineer fill the city council's seat on the board to remove that conflict of interest that we talked about earlier. We also think it would be smart to build a communications council to bring together DPW and the Sewerage and Water Board on street repairs. We think that this option would make a great deal of improvement in the situation. However, it wouldn't solve everything. There are still questions about the long-term effectiveness of the board of directors, and most notably, the Louisiana legislature would still retain substantial control over Sewerage and Water Board matters. The second path would replace the Sewerage and Water Board with a municipal utility that functions as part of city government. This would substantially address many of the problems that we identified. It would consolidate the functions of the Sewerage and Water Board under the umbrella of city government, and it would help align system responsibility and funding control within the city. It would establish a traditional checks and balances review of the city utilities budget at budget time and facilitate coordination. It could also help eliminate redundant administrative functions carried out by both the Sewerage and Water Board and the city. A municipal utility that functions like a traditional city department would eliminate the board of directors and automatically resolve the city council's conflict of interest and concerns about the long-term effectiveness of the board. And it would squarely align decision-making authority and public accountability with the mayor. It would also consolidate more oversight with the city council, because the city council would have legislative authority over a municipal utility, because the new utility functions would be governed by the city's home rule charter and code of ordinances. However, creating a municipal utility would require approval from the legislature, city government, and voters in New Orleans, which would be a lot of work. You would need to have a locally crafted transition plan and a significant public education campaign to explain the proposed governance changes, the benefits of those changes, and a clearly planned transition process would be essential. Moreover, there are other questions about folding the Sewerage and Water Board functions into the city. Is the city, and they're basically, is the city ready to take on such massive roles? Would the city have the competency, the fiscal capacity, and overall readiness to absorb the Sewerage and Water Board's responsibilities? And could it improve the performance of the systems, all while exercising fiscal stewardship? Further study would be needed to pursue these options about the municipal utilities placement within the framework of city government and how you transition Sewerage and Water Board employees to become city employees. I will also note that BGR, in doing this research, we looked at pension issues, civil service and bond issues, and we did not find any obstacles to going in this direction, but further planning would be needed. BGR also recommends, while the city is figuring out which of those long-term options to choose, we see some near-term solutions that can really improve upon this situation. One is that the city council should create a formal process to objectively evaluate funding proposals. This would involve criteria for evaluating and approving those proposals, including independent expert analysis of funding requests and opportunities for public comment. Secondly, BGR recommends that the city council leverage its recent investments in Curo and develop a comprehensive oversight process that relies on true accountability mechanisms to promote improvement. This would include a review of strategic and financial plans, updates on operations, and regular monitoring of system performance. It's notable, though, that these processes may require changes in state law to be effective. Third, BGR recommends that the city and the Sewerage and Water Board officials work together to improve drainage system performance. One of these things would involve determining how much is needed to properly fund the entire drainage system and develop and understand the extent of any funding shortfall. If there is a shortfall, they would also need to develop and secure a new funding source. In 2017, BGR did a report about a stormwater management fee, and we think that research would still be relevant on this question. Once funding is secured, responsibility for maintenance and repair of subsurface drainage should be transferred to the Sewerage and Water Board. We also think that there's more that the Sewerage and Water Board and the city can do to improve coordination and workflow by implementing a shared management information system. So to briefly recap, one governance option would keep but strengthen the current governance structure of the Sewerage and Water Board as a standalone utility. This would be the easier approach, but wouldn't go as far in the changes. The other path would replace the Sewerage and Water Board with a municipal utility. This would be the more difficult path, but could substantially address all of the problems that we identified in our report. The big question there is the overall readiness of city government to assume the functions and responsibilities of the Sewerage and Water Board. So where do we go from here? Each of the major players in the current structure, the city administration, the city council, the Sewerage and Water Board, and the legislature, can take some steps now toward governance improvement. We acknowledge, let's start with the administration, and we acknowledge that the city has been working with the Sewerage and Water Board and the council to study the transfer of drainage responsibility to the Sewerage and Water Board. While it has issued an initial report, it should continue to pursue this issue. It should also continue its efforts to better coordinate with the Sewerage and Water Board on drainage, improving drainage infrastructure repair processes. Meanwhile, the City Council, as you know, has been taking steps to increase its oversight of the Sewerage and Water Board and study the transfer of drainage responsibilities to the Sewerage and Water Board. And finally, the Sewerage and Water Board has been working with the city administration and the City Council to study the transfer of drainage responsibility. The Sewerage and Water Board, we believe, should continue to pursue that issue and continue to pursue coordination with the city. In all of these, again, we recommend that the mayor's office originate on this, but we stress that there is a role for the council, the Sewerage and Water Board, and the public to all come together and decide what is the right path forward. And finally, the Louisiana legislature should be in the loop on all of this and take whatever steps are necessary to implement what the public and the city decide is the best step to move forward. We thank you for this opportunity to present, and we will take any questions you may have.
I have one quick comment, really about the end of the presentation. I find it interesting that from your perspective, the mayor should originate any of these initiatives because historically, mayors don't seek to change any aspect of the sewage and water board structure that does not keep it in a model that is run or controlled by the mayor's office. So it's almost like if at the end you're saying, we think it should be mayorally driven, you're saying, well, we think that nothing should happen.
I hope that's not the case.
I mean, historically, that is the case. I mean, if you look at any of the substantial changes that have happened to sewage and water board in the last 3 years, they've all been council driven. They've been council driven initiatives with legislative partners that have pushed for change whatsoever. The last 2 times the legislature worked with a mayor on governance changes, and I was the author of both of them. They were not dramatic governance changes. We changed who the appointing authorities were, but the mayor still made the appointments. The mayor remained the head of sewage and water board, and many of the long-standing problems you point out in your presentation, none of those were fixed whatsoever. And especially when you look at things in your proposal in the short term, like for example, I have said for a long time, I think the fact that the mayor is the de facto chair of sewage and water board, when almost every mayor does not even attend the sewage and water board meetings, and they typically send a stand-in to sit in that role who may or may not be engaged in the process. I think it's important to look at the historical context that no mayor has ever done this. And I would argue based upon the fact that when this council has done significant regulatory changes, we've been opposed by the administration on every instance. Like I said, I think that's to end your presentation with that is like, here's our ideas. The mayor should do this. I mean, I think that's just, it's sort of like saying, Mr. Putin, will you leave Ukraine?
Thank you for those observations. We do appreciate everything you're saying. Our feeling was that these changes should start with the mayor, just because the mayor is the president of the Sewage and Water Board and, you know, the elected official representing all of New Orleans. We do think it's appropriate that it would start there. However, we just want to see motion on this. We think that our infrastructure continues to deteriorate, and you know, there's no shortage of evidence that this system is not serving any of us well. And
I'd just like to remind you for fact basis, the 2 at-large councilmen also represent every single citizen in the city of New Orleans. So, but I hear you. I think that for the most part, from this council's action, you've seen that we certainly are willing to swing for the fences when it comes to doing something different. The reality is that no sane person can look at the current sewage and water board structure and think that there's not significant room for improvement. And I think a lot of the stuff in your presentation is very well received. I do want to add, and I know we had this in our conversation when we did the presentation, I do give great caution to the idea of having the sewage board remain as a state model, or even to increase the state's participation in the sewage and water board governance, just because we've seen with the increased weaponization of politics at the state level, we've seen the fact that sewage and water board is frequently, despite the efforts of our delegation, the victim of state budget cuts. We've seen with bond commission, which is a really rote procedural body, that politics seem to, at the state level, seem to infest everything. The idea of having a hostile legislature in charge of our water supply, I think would give citizens some pause, but I think it's a tremendous report. It's very helpful. I just wanted to point out those couple of things. I know Councilman Green had his button pressed as well as Councilman Harris. Okay, all right.
And can I just respond to just a couple of things? While our most important thing is to, you know, see action on this subject because we don't think it serves well. One thought also on the mayor is that, let's face it, our mayor is term limited and there are opportunities, I think, sometimes to do something difficult.
I would tend to agree with you, except the greatest challenge we've had, it's not just with this mayor, it's kind of with every department, is the typical response when we're dealing with crises is there's nothing to see here, move along. And it's very challenging. I think it goes back to that old adage, if you can't acknowledge there's a problem, how do you begin solving it? It's very difficult, as you saw, I'm sure when you did your research, as we were trying to get through the billing issue, the wall we kept running our head into as a council is that we couldn't get the sewage and water board to admit to date there's a billing issue. So when you're looking at the host of things where improvement could happen, you'd have to have the sewage and water board agree to your assessment, something needs to be fixed. I've not seen any response to your report saying we agree with this. And I think if you don't have a response from the organization saying that we certainly agree that the governance structure needs to be revisited, I haven't heard that from the Sewage and Water Board. I haven't heard it from its membership or its board or from the administration saying that we think that this is a can we should open. I'd wholeheartedly agree it is a can we should open, but I think that many people have read this report. There seems to be a tremendous amount of interest in doing something. It's just who's going to lead that effort? And do we wait on the administration to do it? Do we get the council to do it? I will say that the group most tasked with resolving this is the legislative delegation, because we can't change anything without their support. I will say that this last legislative session, I've spoken to many legislators. They're tired of having to constantly nibble around the edges on sewage and water board. So your report was well received by legislators who are like, we'd rather stop talking about the sewage and water board in Baton Rouge.
Yeah, I mean, it's tragic. It's in state law. They have the most direct control over it, but as you're saying, they don't even want that control.
No.
They view it as a local issue.
That's true. All right, so Mr. Green, you had your button pressed, then we'll go to Ms. Harris and get press someone else's button. Good over.
Actually, we pressed them, but you can't really see them, so I'm just usually ready to.
Our buttons are all dead. Everybody's buttons are dead. So just press your button and raise your hand. Go ahead, Mr. Green.
So, but you're right, Leslie, the way you're looking is, you mean this button to
Yeah,
speak.
that
There's no
button
button to speak. This is just to speak louder. Okay, but look, I actually, Council President Morrell kind of touched on the issue. But if you're you're suggesting that the mayor and the administration need to push the envelope, if you will, to start those discussions. I guess my question was going to be, and it's a hard one to answer, because you don't also waste a lot of time. Is there support on the state legislative level to get it done? There's a reason that since 1899, there haven't been incredible changes. And part of the reason has to do with the fact that it's just difficult to make change. But at the end of the day, there must be some resistance on a state level beyond our legislative delegation, because some of these changes are potential positive changes. But what do you feel on the state legislative level? Have you spoken to legislators who are supportive of the change?
Our next step is to meet with members of the Orleans legislative delegation. We wanted to meet with all of you within the city first, and we wanted to give the legislature a breather after the session and everything. So we don't have direct reactions from them, but given the number of bills that have been introduced in recent years, tinkering with the governance structure, we hope that they will be all ears on this. And you know, I don't know, to your question about why nothing's really happened so far. Maybe it's that no one's fully taken it on and everybody's just been, you know, trying to tweak things at the margins. I think the most significant thing about this report is that we feel like the root cause of the problems that we all experience on a day-to-day basis with broken infrastructure, wasted water going into the ground, or broken sewer pipes or boil water advisories, things like that, ultimately trace back to this governance structure, because there's a lot of players involved, but there really isn't true accountability and alignment of interests to make sure that there's effective oversight of it. So what we think is that it's time. This situation is not going to get better on its own. We are always going to be dealing with what are ultimately symptoms of the larger problem unless we go for the big issue?
I'm not opposed to a municipal entity that is over just, water and sewer and the like. But I find it interesting. I guess I'm gonna ask you to talk to us again, and feel free to call me after you've talked to the mayor. I don't necessarily think that the mayor would I hear some smiling on the other side, would be completely opposed to a sort of change that creates a municipality that, in a way, empowers us all more on a local level to get change done. But again, I'm speaking to you, haven't had a chance to speak to anyone in the administration about it, but you haven't had a chance yet, if you will, but you're gonna do that.
We have not. We are eager to meet with the administration to walk through all of our findings here in hopes that they will embrace it.
All right, I just don't want to make any assumptions until that happens, because it could be that citizen desires to see changes could motivate things in a little bit different direction. That's all.
Well, and to Mr. Green's point, I think that my experience in the legislature, the reason why you've seen them moving on sewage and water board is because the legislature as a whole is actually very deferential to the city of New Orleans
Sure.
regarding governance. Because when I filed the first bill in 2016, from what we could find, it was the first bill ever filed to deal with governance with sewage and water board. And the legislature's response to that, as long as the delegation itself was in agreement of doing a change, it happened very easily. In my experience, having kind of looked at why in 2016 was the first time we've taken a shot at the governance structure, I think a lot of that was more related to the power of local politics and mayors and their lack of desire to change that structure than anything else. I mean, I think the legislature, when it comes to sewage and water board governance, is largely agnostic, except for the delegation. But to your point, Councilmember Green, if the legislative delegation isn't largely in agreement, it's impossible. Because if the entire delegation, I mean, you could have a split delegation and see success, but if the entire delegation is in complete opposition to something, they defer. So you're right. That's talking to the delegation and getting buy-in is tremendously important if doing anything substantial. Councilman Harris.
I prefer council lady. It's okay. When we met, we talked about exactly what we're talking about. It's almost like, watching Succession and asking Roy to say, I'm going to step off the board. It's not going to happen. So investing this sort of reformation, I think, into any mayor is problematic. And you and I talked about that. You can't ask somebody to fire themselves. But what's funny is I was late because I was coming from a 2-lane public policy class, and I asked them to look at this issue of what to do with the structure of the sewer and water board. And their ultimate conclusion was this, and I think it tracks what Council President Morel is saying, is that citizens largely don't care. What they care about is clean drinking water, that we're not going to get flooded, and that the infrastructure is good. So they don't care about governance structure so much as functionality. And what the 2-lane students came up with are short-term changes, more coordination with DPW on projects, a better billing system, including the smart meter reading. The elimination of the sanitation fee from the water bill so that people understand what they're getting charged for, and that $24 just hanging there, people are confused by it. And frankly, with the backlog of collections that the sewer and water board gets, that means that our sanitation department is not collecting that money either. So that, I think, is an immediate thing that should happen, and I think we can make happen. But their ultimate conclusion is that it should be wrapped back up into city government, that DPW should take over writ large infrastructure, and that sewer and water board should come underneath. They looked at some other privatization, full privatization structures, but you get an outcome like Flint, Michigan, like Jackson. I think the only functioning one that they looked at was Atlanta, and even then there were problems. But again, I think the ultimate conclusion is nobody cares what the structure is, just as long as the outcome is what we need as a citizenry. I think I'm saying that right. So I think you start with the legislators, but I think ultimately you're going to be before us again talking about it, because I just don't see any mayor, and we can look 2 years down the line, 2.5 years down the line, that next mayor is not going to want to say, I'm off the board of directors.
Mhm, mhm. I think those are all terrific comments, and I'm fascinated by having the Tulane students look at this issue as well.
I would want you to meet with them and I'll share their report.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be great. A couple of reactions. One is that our motivation was the same in tackling this issue. You know, no one decides to look at sewage and water board governance just because you want to rearrange all the cards on the table. You do it because you recognize that the current system is irreparably broken, and that we would like to see, it's imperative that things work better for citizens. You shouldn't have to worry about losing your car or your house or business flooding because of, you know, poorly managed and operated drainage system. And your example of the sanitation fee, it's you know, just one more thing that is because of this unusual structure that nobody else does, we complicate things for ourselves. And there are better ways to do it.
Yeah, and listen, again, I think that's something that we can make happen on our end, but the Tulane students, and you know, they're very astute. Another conclusion that they came up with is that we need to think regionally. And again, we talked about this as far as drainage and having a regional collective or a water collective, because as we think about drainage and where our waterlogged where we are, we need to coordinate with Jefferson, with St. Bernard and the surrounding parishes. And so making sure that they're all bought into the system, whatever it comes up with, and making sure that we're collaborating across parish lines, I think is important too.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you guys for the report. You know, everything that we've heard so far I think is an attempt to get us to a better system that delivers and functions better for the citizens. I don't know that anybody's dealt with this from a governance issue, longer than Councilmember Morrell, whether it's with the legislature or whether it's now looking at this particular system as a city councilman. But as I think about it a little bit, you know, and I can kind of go back a few years from being on the board, not being on the board, to looking at how the system works, to reading reports about structure, is the difference that I think now is, first of all, thank you all for offering a couple of models.
Sure.
How those models come together will determine what happens politically and what happens with our willingness to want to do something different. But I think the time we're in now is different, right? And especially coming out of COVID with system challenges, supply chain challenges, inflation, cost, especially when you compare it with the delivery of services in the last couple of decades. I think if we can offer something collective where we're all on the same page, I think looking at a 20th century model and how it doesn't function in a 21st century system, then I think that gives us a better chance looking through this lens right now, because systems are not working because systems are using 20th century models, especially when we talk about municipalities, right? Now, whether that's privatization or who consumes the baby or who runs it, it deserves some study there, because, you know, we talked about one of the great privatization mayors of all time out of Indianapolis, who was a leader, who was a Republican and conservative, who once he became mayor of Indianapolis, he was like, oh Lord, I don't want to privatize this, because when city employees were trained, when there were resources, they actually provided a better, more cost affordable service. But I think right now what we see is system failure because it doesn't have the capacity to work in terms of the present. And what this gives us is a chance to talk to the legislature, to do the things that Councilmember Harris and Councilmember Morrell have been trying to do. I think whether mayors want to give up that authority or not, I think the fact that we're functioning in another century, I think you're going to have to, and especially if we make it a legacy issue about how we best deliver that service. And especially if we look at system failure that continues to happen with the model that operates under now. So I actually want to thank you because, you know, until I read it and walked through it, you know, I had always thought that, you know, people talk about depoliticizing stuff. Well, I looked at all of those different agencies and commissions and boards where they put council presidents and people who aren't political. And then they didn't function any better, right? I looked at those agencies where they removed political appointments and they didn't function any better. So what this tells me is it's deeper than that, right? And we can talk about the politics of stuff, but everything's political. Well, university presidents are political when it comes to their agencies. Engineers are political when it comes to how they engineer and which systems
Right.
they use. Everybody, good government agencies are political when it comes to good government. But with this office, to me, for the first time, is some choices that don't piecemeal. Billing versus the drainage working committee I'm on versus governance. This says, here's a chance to look at them all. Thank you.
Thank you for that perspective, Councilmember Thomas. And I think I really appreciate that very long-term, wide angle view on this. And, you know, maybe rather than getting caught up on, does it start with the mayor, or does it start with the council, or start with the legislature? You know, what we're ultimately talking about is, who knows why ultimately they created this system in 1899, but that was 124 years ago. It's not serving us well.
The drainage authority. Then.
Okay, the drainage authority, but but it was created 124 years ago. It's not serving us well now. So like, let's modernize and pick something different. And we felt like it was too important and there were trade-offs on both sides and there would be so much, you know, involved with planning if you were going to try to fold it into the city. We felt like really what we hoped that this report would do is catalyze a really engaged public conversation and a commitment to doing away with the status quo and doing something different. We can do better and we can come up with a better structure.
And to Councilman Thomas's point, one thing I did learn in the legislature regarding water systems, because there are plenty across the state, I could not find one instance in which privatization ended well. I remember being in the Senate with now Council President Paige Cortez and now Senate President Paige Cortez and Senator Fred Mills, and they were lamenting in some water systems outside of Lafayette that when you have a privatized water system and you have contracting authority about what is required for water to be drinkable and potable, you really get into very awkward conversations. Like, for example, at one point, we on environmental quality had to do an investigation because the water had so much sulfuric content, it smelled like rotten eggs. But because the water was drinkable, it met the contractual requirements of the privatized water system. If the water was discolored and it was yellow, well, if that was just additives that didn't violate any EPA requirements or the contract that was written, it met the criteria. And very quickly, the public realized that, wait a second, when you have a privatization model that revolves around making sure the managing authority is a profitable endeavor, corners get cut. And I would argue that you would find agreement amongst everybody currently on every aspect of government, whether it be the legislature, the council, or the mayor. Privatization really is not on the table when you're looking at essential services like water, just because there's too many opportunities to have a very detrimental outcome to not have something as basic as water handled properly. And I think people are entitled to having drinkable, usable water that doesn't meet the bare minimal standards, but seeks to exceed them.
Absolutely. And yeah, we didn't go down the privatization path for a reason.
All right. Well, there are no other questions. Thank you for your presentation today. We appreciate y'all being here.
Thank you so much for the invitation. We appreciate.
All right, Councilman Harris moves that we adjourn.
Council member,
Here, no objection. We're adjourned.
Sign.
just begging.